Are you seriously just going to leave her sitting there? Miyosh's voice cracked, sharp enough to cut through the din of the crowded restaurant. Boris scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. She's boring, Miyosh. Not my type. Tell Ragnhild I had an emergency. He turned to walk out. Miyosh stared at the empty seat across from his ex-girlfriend's older sister, Ragnhild Jezek. She was looking at her phone, face pale, clearly realizing what was happening. Before Miyosh could think, before the memory of his ex, Notburger, could stop him, he walked over, slid into the empty booth and asked, "Can we date instead?" The air in Laura, the city's newest and most obnoxiously overpriced Italian restaurant, smelled of truffle oil and quiet desperation. Miyosh Eklund hated places like this. He only came because Arthur Nielsen, his chronically unsingle best friend, insisted it was the perfect place to get over Notburger. It hadn't worked. Notburger McDowell's ghost still haunted Miyosh's waking hours, a phantom of sharp laughs and even sharper criticisms. They had broken up 6 months ago. A spectacular, fiery crash of a relationship that left Miyosh feeling hollowed out. He was staring into a glass of overly aggressive Nebbiolo when he saw him. Boris Areno. The guy was a walking cliché, slicked back hair, a trust fund that he wore like a personality trait, and a reputation that preceded him in the worst way possible. Miyosh knew Boris from their brief stint working at the same insufferable tech startup. But what truly made Miyosh's stomach drop wasn't seeing Boris. It was seeing who Boris was walking away from. Ragnhild Jezek. She sat alone at a corner booth, the soft, amber lighting casting long shadows across her face. Ragnhild, Notburger's older sister. Miyosh hadn't seen Ragnhild since the breakup. Where Notburger was loud, vibrant and chaotic, Ragnhild had always been the quiet storm, contained, observant, and possessing a quiet intelligence that Miyosh had always found intimidating. She wore a deep green silk dress that looked entirely out of place against her posture of sudden, crushing defeat. He watched the scene unfold with grim fascination, Boris checking his gold watch, then turning his back on the booth without a second glance. The realization slowly dawning on Ragnhild's face as she checked her phone, the small, almost imperceptible slump of her shoulders. It was cruel. It was deeply, undeniably cruel. Miyosh didn't plan what happened next. If he had planned it, he would have realized the absolute insanity of approaching his ex-girlfriend's sister. He would have remembered the blazing fury with which Notburger had severed all ties. But logic was drowned out by a sudden protective instinct. He remembered the few times he and Ragnhild had spoken, quiet conversations on the periphery of Notburger's loud parties, a shared eye-roll when Notburger became too dramatic. He intercepted Boris near the coat check. "Are you seriously just going to leave her sitting there?" Miyosh demanded, his voice low but vibrating with tension. Boris barely paused. He looked Miyosh up and down, a sneer forming on his perfectly moisturized face. "Miyosh, right? Still slumming it, I see." "Answer the question, Boris." Boris scoffed, adjusting his cuffs with infuriating precision. "She's boring, Miyosh. Not my type. Too intense. Tell Ragnhild I had an emergency. Or don't. I don't care." He turned and walked out, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him with a finality that made Miyosh's blood boil. Miyosh stood there for a long moment, the restaurant's chatter swelling back up around him. He looked back at the corner booth. Ragnhild hadn't moved. She was staring blankly at the untouched glass of water in front of her. He took a deep breath, the air suddenly feeling very thin, and crossed the room. When he reached the booth, he didn't hesitate. He slid into the curved leather seat opposite her. Ragnhild jolted, her eyes snapping up. The surprise in them quickly morphed into confusion, and then, slowly, a guarded recognition. "Miyosh." Her voice was softer than he remembered, a slight huskiness to it. "Boris is an idiot," Miyosh said simply. It was the truest thing he could think of. A flicker of pain crossed her features, quickly masked by a tight, polite smile. "He sent you over to deliver the bad news. How efficient of him." "No," Miyosh corrected. "I saw him leaving. I asked him what he was doing. He told me he was an idiot, basically." Ragnhild let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right. Well, thank you for the update." She reached for her small clutch, signaling the end of the interaction. The humiliation was radiating off her in waves. Miyosh felt a sudden, inexplicable panic. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't want her to walk out of here feeling like she wasn't worth someone's time. "Ragnhild, wait." She paused, her hand hovering over the clasp of her bag. Miłosz looked at her, really looked at her. Her dark hair was pulled back elegantly, drawing attention to the sharp line of her jaw and the deep, unsettling grey of her eyes. She looked incredibly beautiful and incredibly sad. The words tumbled out before his brain could filter them. "Can we date instead?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background hum of the restaurant seemed to pause. Ragnhild stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and something akin to horror. "What did you just say?" Miłosz swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of the cliff he had just thrown himself off. I meant, can we have dinner? Right now, instead of you sitting here alone and me sitting over there with Artur pretending I'm not miserable." He watched the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of options, sitting across from the man who broke her sister's heart. Or whose heart her sister broke, depending on who was telling the story, versus walking out alone, the jilted date. "Miłosz," she started, her tone warning him off. "This is ridiculous. You know who I am." "I know you're not Birger's sister," he said, not breaking eye contact. "But right now you're just Ragnhild, and I'm just Miłosz, and neither of us wants to be alone right now." She held his gaze for a long time. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Finally, she let her hand drop from her clutch. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One dinner." Miłosz felt a smile break across his face, genuine and unforced. He signalled a waiter. As the waiter approached, Miłosz realized the sheer magnitude of the complication he had just introduced into his life. Not Birger would kill him. But looking across the table at Ragnhild as she finally allowed a small, hesitant smile to touch her lips, he decided he didn't care. Dinner with Ragnhild was entirely different from any meal Miłosz had ever shared with Birger. Where Birger was a whirlwind of conversation, rapid-fire opinions, and an insatiable need for attention, Ragnhild was a study in measured silence. They ordered the truffle risotto. Miłosz wasn't sure if it was the absurdity of the situation or genuine hunger, but it was the best thing he had tasted in months. The initial awkwardness hung heavy over the table, a physical barrier they had to navigate around. "So," Miłosz began, twirling a forkful of risotto, "how did you end up on a date with Boris Areno? He doesn't seem like your usual type." Ragnhild took a deliberate sip of wine. She had ordered a Barolo, much more refined than his Nebbiolo. "My usual type?" she echoed, a hint of amusement in her grey eyes. "And what would you know about my usual type, Miłosz?" He felt a flush creep up his neck. "Fair point. I just meant he's loud, obnoxious, and, as we established, an idiot." "It was a setup," she admitted, staring down at her plate. "A mutual acquaintance thought we'd balance each other out." Clearly they were mistaken. "Their loss," Miłosz said, immediately regretting how cliched it sounded. Ragnhild levelled a look at him. "Let's not do this, Miłosz. Let's not pretend this isn't incredibly strange." "It is strange," he agreed. "But it's better than the alternative, isn't it?" She considered this, picking up a piece of bread and turning it over in her hands. "I suppose, but we need to establish some ground rules." "Rules?" Miłosz leaned in, intrigued. "Rule number 1, Ragnhild said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We do not discuss not Birger." Miłosz winced internally. The name alone felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the chasm between them. "Agreed. No, not Birger." "Rule number 2, this is not a date. This is an intervention against a terrible evening. Tomorrow we go back to pretending we barely know each other." Miłosz felt a surprising pang of disappointment. He looked at her, noting the slight tremor in her hands. She was putting up a brave front, but the rejection from Boris had clearly stung. "Rule number 3, he countered, feeling a sudden need to push back. "If we're going to pretend we barely know each other tomorrow, we have to be completely honest tonight." Ragnhild raised an eyebrow. "Honest about what?" "Everything. No polite small talk. No pretending everything is fine. We talk about the real stuff." She seemed to weigh his proposal. "Dangerous territory, Miłosz." "I like living dangerously," he lied. In truth, his life was painfully predictable. A slow, genuine smile spread across Ragnhild's face, changing her entire demeanour. The sadness momentarily vanished, replaced by a sharp, intelligent light. "All right. Honesty. You first. Why were you really here tonight?" Miłosz took a deep breath. "Artur dragged me out. He thinks I'm wallowing." "Are you?" "Spectacularly." Miyosh confessed. I sit in my apartment, I listen to sad indie rock, and I stare at the wall. Ragnhild didn't laugh. She simply nodded, understanding. It takes time. It's been 6 months. 6 months is nothing, she said quietly. Not when you really loved someone. The words hung in the air, a stark violation of rule number 1, even if her name hadn't been spoken. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but heavy with shared, unspoken understanding. They both knew the destruction Notburger could leave in her wake. They moved on, carefully skirting the edges of the crater. They talked about Miyosh's failing freelance design business and Ragnhild's suffocating job at a prestigious architectural firm. They talked about books and, surprisingly, discovered a mutual, intense hatred for a popular contemporary author. For the first time in half a year, Miyosh felt present. He wasn't dwelling on the past or dreading the future. He was entirely focused on the woman across from him, parsing her words, watching the subtle shifts in her expressions. As the waiter cleared their plates and offered dessert, Ragnhild declined. I should probably go, she said, checking her phone. The adrenaline of the stand-up is wearing off and the exhaustion of the week is setting in. Miyosh signaled for the check, insisting on paying despite her protests. He walked her out of the restaurant, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. They stood on the sidewalk, the city bustling around them. Thank you, Ragnhild said, pulling her coat tighter around her, for salvaging the evening. It was unexpectedly tolerable. High praise, Miyosh smiled. You're welcome. He watched her hail a cab. As she opened the door, she turned back to him. Miyosh? Yeah? She hesitated, her grey eyes searching his face. Rule number 2, the one about going back to pretending we barely know each other tomorrow. I remember. I might have been hasty about that one. Before he could process what she meant, she slipped into the cab. The door slammed shut and the taxi merged into the traffic, leaving Miyosh standing on the curb, his heart hammering an unsteady rhythm against his ribs. He had just broken the cardinal rule of breakups. He had crossed enemy lines, and the terrifying part was he couldn't wait to do it again. The following morning felt surreal. Miyosh woke up to the harsh light of his underfurnished apartment, half expecting the previous night to have been a stress-induced fever dream. He checked his phone. No messages, just a notification from Arta, a string of question marks sent at 2 a.m. asking where he had disappeared to. He spent the morning trying to work on a logo design for a local bakery, but his mind kept drifting back to Ragnhild. Her sharp wit, her vulnerability when she thought he wasn't looking, the surprising warmth in her laugh. He realized with a sinking feeling that he was utterly fixated. It was dangerous. It was a minefield. Notburger was not someone who let go easily, even when she was the one who did the letting go. She viewed the people in her life as possessions, and Miyosh knew deep down she probably still considered him hers, even in absence. Around noon, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. I believe I left my scarf at the restaurant. A grey cashmere one. Did you happen to see it? Ah. Miyosh stared at the message. It was a thinly veiled excuse. He hadn't seen a scarf. He knew she hadn't had a scarf. He replied quickly, I didn't see it, but I'm heading that way later. I can check with the restaurant if you want. Her reply was instantaneous. That would be helpful. Thank you. A pause. Then another message. Are you free for coffee? To discuss the, scarf situation. Miyosh grinned, a genuine wide smile that felt alien on his face. They met at a quiet, unassuming cafe far away from the trendy districts where Notburger and her friends usually congregated. It felt illicit, like they were fugitives. Ragnhild was already there when he arrived, nursing an espresso. She looked tired, but the tension from the previous night was gone. Any luck with the scarf? She asked, a knowing look in her eye. Tragically, no, Miyosh said, taking the seat opposite her. The restaurant denied all knowledge of any cashmere. A shame, she said smoothly. It was a gift. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, picking up the threads of conversation from the night before. They talked about architecture, Miyosh learning that Ragnhild felt stifled by her firm's conservative approach. She wanted to design spaces that felt alive, not just imposing. You should start your own firm, Miyosh suggested, leaning forward. Ragnhild let out a short, cynical laugh. It's not that simple, Miyosh. The capital required, the connections. My current firm, Olivetti & Partners, they hold a monopoly on the good contracts in this city. Nicola Olivetti is not someone you cross. Miosh noted the name, Olivetti. It sounded vaguely familiar, perhaps from one of Notburger's endless rants about high society drama. Still, Miosh argued gently, staying somewhere that makes you miserable isn't the answer either. Ragnhild looked at him, her gaze softening. You're surprisingly optimistic for someone who spent the last 6 months staring at a wall. Maybe I just needed a change of scenery, he said quietly, holding her gaze. The moment was interrupted by the harsh ringtone of Ragnhild's phone. She glanced at the screen and the colour drained from her face. She hastily silenced the phone and flipped it face down on the table. Who was it? Miosh asked, though he already had a sinking suspicion. My mother, Ragnhild said, her voice tight. Annunziata, she demands regular updates, especially on Sundays. Miosh knew of Annunziata Cecilia. Notburger had spoken of her mother with a mixture of awe and terror. She was a formidable woman, a matriarch who ruled her family with an iron fist and a razor-sharp tongue. Does she know about last night? Miosh asked carefully. About Boris? Ragnhild nodded grimly. The news travels fast in her circles. She's probably calling to dissect the failure and inform me of my inadequacies. Don't answer, Miosh said firmly. Not right now. Ragnhild looked surprised by his vehemence. I have to, eventually. Avoidance only makes it worse with her. Then answer it later. Right now you're having coffee with me. She offered a small, grateful smile. Okay, later. They spent another hour at the cafe, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Miosh realized how easy it was to talk to her. There was no performance, no need to impress. It was just two people connecting in the quiet spaces. When they finally left, they walked together toward the nearest subway station. So, Miosh said, hands deep in his pockets, when do I get to see you again? Ragnhild stopped walking. She looked at him, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face, desire, hesitation, and a very real fear. Miosh, she started, her voice low. You know what this is, right? You know what happens if we do this? I know it's complicated, he admitted. It's not just complicated. It's a declaration of war. Notburger will lose her mind. My mother will be furious. It will be chaos. Are you saying you don't want to? Miosh challenged, stepping closer. She looked up at him, her grey eyes dark and intense. I'm saying I'm terrified of what I want. Before he could respond, before he could reassure her, a voice cut through the street noise like a siren. Well, 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 if it isn't the ghost of relationships past. Miosh turned, his blood freezing in his veins. Standing a few feet away, holding a shopping bag and wearing an expression of pure, unadulterated venom, was Notburger. The street noise, the rattle of a passing delivery truck, the distant wail of a siren, the hum of hundreds of conversations seemed to instantly vacuum out of Miosh's ears. The world narrowed to the few feet of pavement separating him, Ragnhild, and the hurricane that was Notburger McDowell. Notburger stood with one hip cocked, a heavy designer shopping bag dangling from the crook of her arm. She wore a bright crimson trench coat that seemed to absorb the dreary afternoon light and weaponize it. Her blonde hair was perfectly tousled, and her lips were painted a shade of red that Miosh intimately knew left stains on everything it touched. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes, sharp and predatory, were fixed entirely on her older sister. Ragnhild, Notburger purred, the syllables dripping with a sickly sweet malice. I thought Mother said you were spending your Sunday chained to your drafting table for Olivetti, yet here you are, strolling through the city. Her gaze finally slowly slid over to Miosh. She looked him up and down as if he were a particularly uninteresting piece of roadkill. And with my leftovers, no less. Miosh felt a flare of white-hot anger ignite in his chest. Notburger, that's enough. Oh, Miosh, please, she scoffed, waving a manicured hand dismissively. Don't try to play the white knight. It doesn't suit your budget. She turned back to her sister. Seriously, Raggy, I knew you had a complex about living in my shadow, but picking up the men I throw away, that's a new level of pathetic, even for you. Miosh instinctively took a half step forward, placing himself slightly between Ragnhild and Notburger. But Ragnhild reached out, her fingers wrapping gently but firmly around his bicep, stopping him. When she spoke, her voice was startlingly calm, though Miosh could feel the fine tremor in her hand. Hello, Notburger, Ragnhild said, her tone as smooth and cold as polished marble. Miosh and I bumped into each other. He was helping me look for a scarf I lost. It was the lie they had fabricated, but under Notburger's scrutinizing glare, it sounded incredibly flimsy. Notburger's eyes narrowed into calculating slits. She looked at Miyosh's defensive posture, at Ragnhild's hand still lingering on his arm, and then let out a sharp, genuine laugh that grated against Miyosh's spine. "A scarf?" Notburger mocked. "Right, and I'm sure you were looking for it at the bottom of his coffee cup. You always were a terrible liar, Raggy. You over-explain." Notburger took a step closer, the scent of her heavy floral perfume invading Miyosh's personal space, dragging up 100 memories he had spent 6 months trying to bury. "Let me give you some sisterly advice," Notburger whispered, loud enough for both of them to hear. "He's a project, a starving artist who can't commit to a deadline, let alone a future. And you're the boring, reliable sister who builds boxes for a living. You don't know how to handle someone like him. He'll drain you dry and then resent you for it." "You don't know anything about him anymore," Ragnhild said quietly. "And you certainly don't know anything about me." "I know Mother had lunch with Nicola Olivetti yesterday," Notburger countered, her smile widening into something truly venomous. She paused, letting the name of Ragnhild's tyrannical boss hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "They were talking about the new waterfront project. It would be a shame if you were distracted by unnecessary drama right now. Mother wouldn't tolerate it. You know how she despises embarrassment to the family name." Ragnhild's face went a shade paler, her composure cracking just a fraction. It was the exact reaction Notburger was fishing for. "We're leaving," Miyosh said, his voice hard. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Ragnhild's hand, a bold, undeniable gesture, and pulled her gently down the street, away from the poison radiating from his ex-girlfriend. "Enjoy the mess," Notburger called out after them, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Don't say I didn't warn you." They walked in silence for 3 whole blocks, Miyosh's hand firmly encompassing Ragnhild's. He didn't let go until they turned a corner, finally shielded by the brick facade of an old library. Ragnhild pulled her hand away, leaning her back against the brick wall and closing her eyes. She let out a long, ragged exhale. "I told you," she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain she had been holding back. "I told you. It would be chaos." "She's bluffing," Miyosh said, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "She's just trying to get into your head." Ragnhild opened her eyes, fixing him with a look of profound exhaustion. "Notburger doesn't bluff, Miyosh. She strategizes, and she just declared war." The neon sign of the Rusty Anchor hummed with a low electrical buzz that matched the anxiety vibrating beneath Miyosh's skin. He sat in a sticky booth, nursing a tepid beer while Arthur Nielsen, his best friend and reluctant confidant, stared at him as if he had just sprouted a second head. "Let me get this perfectly straight," Arthur said, wiping a speck of foam from his dark beard. "You went to Laura to mourn the she-devil. You saw Boris Trust Fund Areno dump a woman. You swoop in to save the day, and that woman turns out to be Ragnhild Jezek, the older sister of the she-devil." "I knew who she was before I walked over," Miyosh corrected miserably. "That makes it exponentially worse." Arthur threw his hands up, nearly knocking over his own pint. "Miyosh, are you fundamentally broken? Do you lack a basic survival instinct? Notburger is going to unmake you. She will salt the earth where your freelance business stands. She will hire a shaman to curse your bloodline." "She already caught us together," Miyosh admitted, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. "Yesterday, on the street." Arthur slowly lowered his hands, the theatrical outrage draining from his face, replaced by genuine concern. "Oh, mate, what did she say?" "Enough to terrify Ragnhild," Miyosh said, rubbing his temples. "She brought up their mother, Annunziata, and Ragnhild's boss." Arthur whistled lowly. "Annunziata, Cecilia! I've heard rumours about that woman. They say she once destroyed a local politician's career because he sat in her reserved pew at church. If Notburger points that weapon at you two..." Miyosh's phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Ragnhild. "Can you meet me? The conservatory at the Botanical Gardens. 3 p.m. "I have to go," Miyosh said, tossing a crumpled 20 onto the table. Arthur grabbed his wrist before he could stand. "Listen to me. I know you've been lonely. I know you've been hurting, but this isn't a rom-com, Miyosh. This is stepping on a landmine because you liked the way the metal looked. Be careful." "I can't just leave her to deal with this alone," Miyosh replied, pulling his arm free. "I started it." An hour later, Miosh was walking through the heavy, humid air of the city's grand botanical conservatory. Lush green ferns and towering orchids choked the air with the smell of damp earth and blooming life. He found Ragnhild sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath a massive weeping fig tree, looking entirely out of place in her structured grey power suit. She looked up as his footsteps echoed on the stone path. The dark circles under her eyes were stark against her pale skin. "What happened?" Miosh asked, sitting beside her. "Constance warned me," Ragnhild said softly. Constance Simpson was a senior architect at Olivetti and Partners, and one of the few people there Ragnhild actually trusted. "She pulled me aside this morning. Nicola Olivetti pulled my files for the waterfront development. He's looking for errors. He's looking for a reason to take me off the project." Miosh felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. "Because of Notburger?" "Because of my mother," Ragnhild corrected bitterly. Notburger went straight to her. Annunziata hates scandal, but more than that, she hates defiance. Me dating the man Notburger discarded, which is the narrative they've undoubtedly constructed, is a slap in the face to the family's image. My mother funds half of Nicola's private galas. A word from her and I'm back to fetching coffee and drafting parking garages. "Ragnhild, I'm so sorry," Miosh whispered, feeling the crushing weight of guilt. "I brought this on you." Ragnhild turned to look at him. To his surprise, there was no anger in her unsettling grey eyes, only a fierce, determined spark. "You gave me an out that night at the restaurant," she said quietly. "But I chose to stay. I chose to meet you for coffee. I chose to hold your hand when she confronted us." She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. "I spent my whole life being the quiet, compliant daughter so Notburger could be the hurricane. I'm tired of being compliant, Miosh." Miosh caught her hand, pressing her palm against his cheek. The humidity of the greenhouse wrapped around them, isolating them from the concrete jungle and the venomous people outside. "So we fight back?" he asked. "No," Ragnhild said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. "We survived them, together." The attack, when it came, was swift and entirely unprovoked. Miosh was sitting at his makeshift desk, a slab of reclaimed wood propped up on two filing cabinets, staring at vector graphics on his monitor when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Alois Fizerova, the owner of a boutique hotel chain and Miosh's most lucrative freelance client. This contract was the only thing keeping Miosh from drowning in rent arrears. "Alois, good morning," Miosh answered, forcing a cheerful professionalism into his voice. "I was just about to send over the revised branding deck." "Miosh, I'm going to stop you right there." Alois's voice was clipped, lacking its usual warmth. "I'm calling to inform you that we are terminating our contract, effective immediately." Miosh froze, his hand hovering over his mouse. "Excuse me? Terminating?" "Alois, we're 2 weeks away from launch. Is there an issue with the designs? I can revise." "The designs are fine," Alois interrupted with a heavy sigh. "This is complicated. Let's just say unforeseen circumstances have arisen regarding our marketing budget. We've decided to go with an internal team." "Internal team?" Miosh echoed, his mind racing. "Alois, you don't have an internal design team." There was a long, excruciating pause on the other end of the line. "Mathieu Cosciarelli's agency has offered to absorb the branding package as part of a larger PR deal," Alois finally muttered, sounding deeply uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Miosh. It's strictly business. I'll ensure you're compensated for the work completed to date." The line went dead. Miosh stared at the screen, the vector shapes blurring together. Mathieu Cosciarelli, the man was a slick, high-powered PR executive and, more importantly, Notburger's latest obsession and frequent +1 to high society galas. Notburger hadn't just fired a warning shot, she had aimed directly for his throat. Losing the Fizerova contract didn't just hurt, it crippled him. He had 2 months of rent in savings, max. After that, he'd be begging Arthur for a spot on his couch. He spent the next 3 hours in a state of numb panic, drafting emails to old clients, begging for scraps of work. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, depressing shadows across his apartment, he felt utterly defeated. A knock at the door broke his spiral. He opened it to find Ragnhild standing in the hallway, holding 2 greasy brown paper bags that smelled heavenly of cheap Chinese takeout. She wore dark jeans and a simple, oversized sweater, looking softer and more approachable than he had ever seen her. "I figured neither of us had the energy to cook," she said, offering a tired smile. Then she really looked at him. Her smile vanished. "What's wrong?" You look like a ghost." Miłosz wanted to lie. He wanted to be the strong one, the protective one. But the exhaustion in his bones won out. He stepped aside, letting her in. They sat on the floor of his sparsely furnished living room, the takeout boxes open between them. The only light came from the street lamp outside the window, casting a warm amber glow over the room. Miłosz told her everything. The phone call, the Fizerova contract, the blatant manoeuvring by Matteo Cosciarelli on Notburga's behalf. "She's trying to starve me out," Miłosz said with a hollow laugh, poking at his low mane. "Make me so desperate I have to leave the city, or at least, leave you." Ragnhild was silent for a long time. She set her chopsticks down and moved closer to him, the space between them evaporating. "Nicola took me off the waterfront project this afternoon," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "He said my recent lack of focus was a liability to the firm's reputation. He reassigned me to cataloguing archived blueprints in the basement." They looked at each other, two people thoroughly battered by a storm they had willingly walked into. The sheer unfairness of it hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket woven by Notburga's malice and Annunziata's pride. "We should stop," Miłosz said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We should tell them we're done. Tell them it was a mistake. They'll back off." "Is it a mistake?" Ragnhild asked. Her grey eyes were intense, searching his face in the dim light. "No," Miłosz breathed, his heart catching in his throat. "It's the most real thing I've felt in a year." "Then I'm not backing down," Ragnhild said fiercely. "I spent 28 years letting those women dictate my worth and my boundaries. I'm not letting them take this. I'm not letting them take you." The air in the room shifted, the tension transforming from anxiety into something electric and incredibly heavy. Miłosz looked at her. The sharp line of her jaw, the defiant fire in her eyes, the soft vulnerability of her mouth. He realized with absolute certainty that he was entirely in love with her. Not as a rebound, not as an act of revenge, but with her. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, feeling the slight tremble in her skin. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. Miłosz closed the distance between them. The kiss started slow, hesitant, a silent question asked and answered in the dark. But as their lips met, the dam broke. It was a kiss fueled by a week of suppressed terror, crushing pressure, and an undeniable, overwhelming gravity. Ragnhild's hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the floor while everything else in their lives spun out of control. Miłosz wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, desperate to memorize the feeling of her against him. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But as they held each other on the floor of his crumbling life, Miłosz knew he would burn down the rest of his world just to keep her in it. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Miłosz's apartment, casting long, golden bars across the hardwood floor where he and Ragnhild had fallen asleep, tangled in a blanket and each other. Miłosz woke first. He lay perfectly still, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of Ragnhild's breathing. The crushing anxiety that had suffocated him the day before was gone, replaced by a crystalline, sharp-edged clarity. They couldn't just survive. If they stayed on the defensive, Annunziata and Notburga would eventually grind them into dust. They needed to go on the offensive. When Ragnhild finally stirred, her grey eyes fluttering open to meet his, Miłosz didn't offer a gentle morning greeting. "We need a whale," he said, his voice raspy but firm. Ragnhild blinked, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Good morning to you too. And what exactly does that mean?" "Alois Fizerova was a big client, but he's a coward who bows to high society pressure," Miłosz explained, sitting up and running a hand through his messy hair. "Nicola Olivetti relies on your mother's social capital to secure city contracts. They operate in an ecosystem built on old money and nepotism. To beat them, we need someone outside their ecosystem. Someone with enough money and power to make Annunziata Cecilia look like a small-town PTA president." Ragnhild sat up slowly, her architectural mind catching up to his frantic creative energy. "You're talking about a completely independent developer. Someone who doesn't care about the local social registry." "Exactly," Miłosz said, grabbing his phone off the coffee table. He dialed Artur's number. It rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. "Miłosz, if you are calling from a jail cell because Notburga framed you for arson, I am hanging up," Artur mumbled. "Artur, wake up, I need your brain," Miłosz demanded. "Who is the biggest, most aggressive new money developer operating in the city right now? Someone who hates the establishment." There was a long pause, followed by the sound of rustling sheets. "You're insane, but you're looking for Gustav Marchal. He's a Swedish venture capitalist who just bought the entire abandoned rail yard district on the south side. Word on the street is he told the Heritage Committee to go to hell when they tried to restrict his zoning." Mios looked at Ragnhild. Her eyes widened, a spark of pure electricity igniting in them. She mouthed the words, "The rail yard." "Arthur, you're a genius. Buy you a pint later," Mios said, hanging up. He turned to Ragnhild. "You know the rail yard?" "Know it." Ragnhild scrambled to her feet, suddenly buzzing with adrenaline. "Mios, I've spent the last 2 years secretly drafting a revitalization project for that exact district. It was my passion project. I pitched a fraction of it to Olivetti last year and he laughed me out of his office. He called it impractical bohemian nonsense." "Show me," Mios said. For the next 48 hours, Mios's apartment transformed into a war room. Ragnhild brought over heavy tubes of blueprints and her high-powered laptop, projecting 3D renderings onto Mios's blank living room wall. Her vision was breathtaking. It wasn't just a development, it was a living, breathing ecosystem. Interconnected green spaces, sustainable brutalist architecture softened by cascading vertical gardens, and a massive central hub designed for artists, independent businesses, and community living. It was the absolute antithesis of Olivetti's sterile glass boxes. While Ragnhild refined the structural data, Mios drank an ungodly amount of black coffee and built the soul of the project. He designed a brand identity that screamed revolution. Bold industrial typography fused with vibrant organic color palettes. He named it the Catalyst. They worked in tandem, moving around each other with an effortless choreography. When Ragnhild's eyes grew heavy at 3 a.m., Mios rubbed her shoulders and brought her tea. When Mios hit a creative wall, Ragnhild would sit beside him, her quiet presence grounding his frantic thoughts. They were no longer just a rebound or an act of rebellion. They were a partnership, forged in fire. On Wednesday morning, Mios leveraged every favor Arthur owed him to get a 10-minute meeting with Gustav Marchal's acquisitions director. But when they arrived at the sleek, minimalist downtown office, they weren't ushered into a boardroom. They were led straight into the penthouse suite. Gustav Marchal was a towering man with a shaved head, piercing blue eyes, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than Mios's annual rent. He didn't sit behind his desk. He leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city like a hawk surveying a field of mice. "Arthur Nielsen is a persistent mosquito, but he swore you two had something that would piss off the mayor," Gustav said, his accent thick and unapologetic. "You have exactly 5 minutes to prove him right before I have security throw you out." Mios didn't flinch. He walked to the conference table, opened his laptop and connected it to the massive screen on the wall. "Mr. Marchal, you bought the rail yard because you want to leave a legacy. But right now, the city's old guard is circling you, hoping you'll hire one of their tired firms so they can siphon your capital and water down your vision." Mios hit a button. The screen flared to life with the bold, striking logo of the Catalyst. "We aren't here to build you a neighborhood." Ragnhild stepped forward, her voice steady, powerful, and devoid of the timidness she wore at Olivetti's firm. She looked magnificent. "We are here to build you a revolution." For the next 20 minutes, ignoring the 5-minute limit entirely, Ragnhild walked him through the architectural brilliance of the space, while Mios pitched the cultural impact. They showed him how it would completely bypass the high society gatekeepers and appeal directly to the city's vibrant, neglected youth and creative class. When they finished, silence descended on the room. Gustav stared at the 3D rendering of the central plaza, his jaw tight. He slowly turned to look at Ragnhild. "You work for Nicola Olivetti," Gustav stated, a dangerous edge to his voice. "The man is a parasite." "I am employed by him, yes," Ragnhild said, lifting her chin. "But he took me off all active projects because my mother, Annunziata Cecilia, finds my personal life distasteful. They want me drafting parking garages in the basement to teach me a lesson in obedience." Gustav let out a sudden booming laugh that rattled the glass windows. "Ah, so you are a renegade, and he pointed a thick finger at Mios. "You are the graphic designer Notburger McDowell has been trying to blacklist all week. Mattia Cozziarelli actually called me yesterday to suggest I avoid you." Mios felt his stomach drop, but he forced himself to hold Gustav's gaze. "And what did you tell him?" Gustav sneered. "I told him I don't take advice from men who wear ascots." The billionaire pushed off the window and walked toward them. This design, it is brilliant. It is exactly the kind of middle finger I want to plant in the center of this city. He extended a massive hand toward Ragnhild, then to Miosh. You both just found your whale, but we do this my way, and my way requires a very public execution. The annual Heritage Foundation Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of the city's social calendar. It was a suffocating sea of designer gowns, inherited diamonds, and forced smiles. Annunziata Cecilia was on the board of directors, which meant Notburger treated the event as her personal coronation. Miosh adjusted the cuffs of his rented tuxedo, feeling entirely out of place amidst the glittering chandeliers and the string quartet playing in the corner of the grand ballroom. But as he looked at Ragnhild, the anxiety melted away. She was a revelation. She had shed the conservative grey suits entirely. Instead, she wore a sleek architectural gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her curves and featured a daring, asymmetrical neckline. She looked like a queen stepping out of a shadow, radiant and untouchable. "Ready?" Miosh whispered, offering his arm. "More than I've ever been," she replied, slipping her hand through his. Their entrance caused a visible ripple through the crowd. Whispers erupted like dry brush catching fire. Miosh spotted Boris Areno near the champagne fountain. Boris took one look at Ragnhild, choked slightly on his drink and quickly turned away, his face pale. It didn't take long for the main predators to circle. Before they could reach the center of the room, a path cleared and Notburger materialized. She was draped in gold sequins hanging off the arm of the impossibly smug Mathieu Cosiarelli. Trailing just behind them was the matriarch herself, Annunziata Cecilia, a woman whose glacial stare could freeze boiling water, and an incredibly nervous-looking Nicola Olivetti. "Ragnhild," Annunziata said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. "What is the meaning of this? You were explicitly told this event was for senior partners and family in good standing." "Hello, Mother," Ragnhild said, her voice impossibly calm. "I am here as a guest." Notburger laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "A guest of who? The waitstaff? Honestly, Raggy, dragging your little charity case to $1,000 a plate dinner is a new low. Mathieu had to personally intervene just to keep Miosh from begging for scraps in the lobby." Mathieu adjusted his lapels, puffing out his chest. "Just business, Miosh. The market is competitive. Only the strong survive." Miosh felt a familiar spike of anger, but he simply smiled. "I couldn't agree more, Mathieu. The weak do tend to rely on their girlfriends' mothers to secure their deals." Mathieu's smug expression faltered, a flash of red creeping up his neck. "Enough!" Annunziata snapped, stepping forward to loom over Ragnhild. "You will leave this instant. You are embarrassing the family name. Tomorrow morning, Nicola will accept your formal resignation. You are done in this city, Ragnhild. You have chosen a beggar over your blood." Nicola Olivetti dabbed his sweating forehead with a silk handkerchief, looking anywhere but at Ragnhild. "It's true, my dear. Your lack of focus. It's just not a good fit anymore." Ragnhild didn't shrink back. She didn't look at the floor. She looked her mother dead in the eye, a serene smile playing on her lips. "I won't be resigning tomorrow, Nicola, because I quit 3 hours ago via email. And I'm not leaving, Mother. Our host is about to make an announcement." As if summoned by her words, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The heavy tap of a microphone echoed through the ballroom. On the grand sweeping staircase overlooking the crowd stood Gustav Marschall. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand and the microphone in the other. The room fell into a terrified, breathless silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, parasites and socialites," Gustav boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Thank you for inviting me to this charming little display of outdated wealth." Annunziata stiffened, her jaw clenching so hard Miosh thought her teeth might shatter. "I am here tonight to announce the future of this city," Gustav continued, pacing the landing. "The Nova District, a $2 billion revitalization of the southern rail yards. I know many of the esteemed architectural firms in this room." He glared pointedly at Nicola Olivetti. "Hope to secure this contract with their boring, uninspired glass boxes. But I have zero interest in the past." Gustav raised his glass, scanning the crowd until his eyes locked onto Miosh and Ragnhild. "I have chosen a team that understands the future, a team that isn't afraid to tear down the old rot to build something magnificent. I want to publicly introduce the lead architect of the Nova District, the brilliant Ragnhild Jezek, and the visionary creative director of the project, Miosh Eklund." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum of shock. Then, slowly, the press corps at the back of the room erupted into a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Miłosz looked at the faces of his tormentors. Matteo Cosciarelli looked like he was going to be sick. Nicola Olivetti's knees literally gave out, forcing him to lean heavily against a cocktail table. But it was Notburger and Annunziata who truly broke. Notburger's face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly fury. She opened her mouth to scream, but the noise of the reporters drowned her out. Annunziata, the immovable matriarch, simply stared at her eldest daughter in profound, terrified realization. She had spent decades trying to crush Ragnhild into a small, manageable box, and in doing so, she had forged a diamond that had just cut her empire to ribbons. Ragnhild didn't gloat, she didn't sneer, she simply turned her back on her mother and her sister, wrapping her arms securely through Miłosz's. "Shall we go talk to the press, partner?" she asked, her grey eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute victory. "Lead the way," Miłosz smiled. The aftermath was a glorious, chaotic whirlwind. By the end of the week, the social hierarchy of the city had been completely rewritten. The news of Gustav Marschall's massive investment and his scathing rebuke of Olivetti and partners sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Nicola Olivetti's firm lost 3 major contracts in the span of 4 days, clients suddenly desperate to associate themselves with the fresh, rebellious energy of the Catalyst project. Miłosz sat on a paint-splattered ladder in the centre of a massive, sun-drenched loft in the industrial district. The space had exposed brick, 20-foot ceilings, and massive arched windows. It was the newly leased headquarters of Jezek and Eklund Design. He dipped a roller into a tray of vibrant, mustard-yellow paint and applied it to the accent wall, whistling off-key. The heavy freight elevator doors clattered open and Ragnhild walked in, balancing 2 large cardboard boxes and a tray of iced coffees. She wore denim overalls and a white t-shirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun. To Miłosz, she had never looked more beautiful. "Constance says hello," Ragnhild announced, setting the boxes down with a heavy thud. Miłosz climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on a rag. "Did she officially accept the offer?" "She did," Ragnhild grinned, handing him a coffee. "She handed her resignation to Nicola this morning. Apparently he actually cried, offered to double her salary. She told him to save his money for the impending lawsuits from the city planning board." Miłosz laughed, taking a long sip of the cold caffeine. "And what about the Wicked Witch of the West?" Ragnhild's smile softened slightly, taking on a more reflective quality. "Notburger called me last night. Actually called me, didn't just have an assistant text. She's struggling." Matteo dumped her the moment he realized she had lost her social leverage and that her mother's name was suddenly toxic to his PR brand. "Did you pick up?" Miłosz asked gently, stepping closer to her. "No," Ragnhild said, shaking her head. "I didn't block her, but I didn't answer. I spent 28 years trying to fix her messes and absorb her cruelty. I'm done. I don't wish her harm, Miłosz, but I don't have space for her in my life anymore. This space..." She gestured around the empty, echoing loft. "This is for us, for building things, not tearing them down." Miłosz reached out, pulling her gently by the straps of her overalls until she stepped into his chest. The smell of fresh paint, coffee, and her subtle floral shampoo enveloped him. He thought back to that night at the restaurant, the sheer, impulsive madness of sitting down in Boris Areno's abandoned booth. He had done it out of a mix of pity and lingering spite toward Notburger. But what he had found was the most profound, anchoring love of his life. He had found a partner who matched his fire, who challenged him, and who stood beside him when the world tried to crush them. "I have a confession to make," Miłosz murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "Oh?" Ragnhild raised an eyebrow, her hands coming up to rest on his paint-flecked chest. "Should I be worried?" "That night at the restaurant," Miłosz said softly, "I didn't just ask you to date me to save you from humiliation. I asked because I looked at you, really looked at you, and realized I had spent the last 2 years looking at the wrong sister." Ragnhild let out a breathless laugh, her grey eyes crinkling at the corners. She tilted her chin up, closing the remaining distance between them. When they kissed, there was no desperation, no frantic energy fueled by anxiety and fear. It was slow, deep, and incredibly grounded. It was the kiss of 2 people who had walked through a hurricane hand in hand and had finally reached the quiet, sunlit shore. They had broken the chains of expectations, of toxic family dynamics, and of past heartbreaks. As Miłosz held Ragnhild in the center of the empire they were building together, he knew they hadn't just survived, they had won. Stepping into the unknown takes immense courage, especially when the past is trying desperately to hold you back. Miłosz and Ragnhild's journey reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin with a seemingly disastrous twist of fate. They refuse to be defined by the toxic people who abandoned them, choosing instead to build an empire of love, respect, and mutual ambition out of the ashes of their pain. True power doesn't come from old money or social status. It comes from knowing your worth and finding a partner who sees your brilliance when the rest of the world turns away. If you enjoyed this emotional story of taking back power, defying the odds and finding true love in the most unexpected places, please hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a good comeback story, and subscribe for more dramatic romances.